In the heart of a storm, when the world had gone quiet and the snow spoke in whispers, a mother dog appeared at a stranger's door, her breath shallow, her pups trembling beneath her. She had nothing left, except hope. She stopped at the doorstep of a man who had locked the world out years ago. And what happened next changed both of them. If stories like this touch something quiet in your heart, please consider liking this video, subscribing to our channel, and staying with us until the very last snowfall melts. Because this is more than a story. It's a reminder that kindness still lives, even in the coldest places. In the far northern reaches of Montana, where the Bitterroot Mountains claw at the sky and the wind carried the weight of old wilderness secrets, a blizzard was settling in like a slow, merciless curtain. The small town of Clearwater, less than 300 residents and one working traffic light, was already buried under snow, with the radio warning of the worst cold front in decades sweeping in from Canada. The thermometer outside the solitary cabin on Timberwolf Ridge read -30 degrees and falling. Inside the cabin, Noah Walker moved with a kind of practiced stillness that spoke not of fear, but of someone who had made peace with solitude. At 58 years old, he was tall and lean, his frame wrapped in layers of wool and memory. His face bore a beard streaked with white and gray, and his blue-gray eyes, once bright with ambition, had dimmed into something more reflective like still water hiding the current beneath. Once, this cabin had been meant for two. When Noah first bought the land in Montana, he and his wife, Margaret, had dreamed of retiring here together, raising chickens, growing wildflowers, reading poetry by the fire. Margaret had been a small, graceful woman with auburn hair flecked with silver, always tied back in a hand-sewn scarf. She was the kind of person who remembered every birthday, whispered stories to children at the library, and left wildflowers on the neighbor's porch without a name. Soft-spoken but firm in her kindness, Margaret believed in quiet things, tea over coffee, handwritten letters over emails, and forgiveness, even when it hurt. But cancer, like frost in the soil, crept in without warning and bloomed in silence. She passed just a year after their daughter Ellie, who had died suddenly in a drunk driving accident at 20, leaving Noah surrounded not by family, but by echoes. After that, the cabin became less of a home and more of a shrine, its wooden walls lined not just with hand-hewn beams, but with sorrow. Now, in this unforgiving February, the storm outside mirrored the storm within. Noah moved through the cabin with a methodical grace, fastening storm shutters, checking fuel reserves, and testing the backup generator. The wind outside battered the windows like some ancient thing demanding entry. He paused only once, at the fireplace, tossing in another log and staring into the flame. A photo of Ellie sat on the mantel 10 years old, laughing beside a German shepherd named Ranger, her blonde curls wild in the wind, her smile eternal. Ranger had died 2 years before Ellie, and sometimes Noah wondered if the dog had sensed the coming fracture in their world. The fire crackled, the clock ticked. Outside, the wind began to wail. Noah donned his heavy coat and stepped onto the porch, flashlight in hand. The air bit into his skin like broken glass. He scanned the yard, then the tree line. Everything was white, no detail, no depth. Even the familiar pine trail had vanished beneath thick drifts. But something felt off. The storm had a strange stillness to it, like a held breath. Then a sound, soft, distant, a low thunk, 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 rhythmic and muffled by snow. He paused. Again. Thunk, thunk. Then silence. He swept the flashlight slowly across the tree line. Nothing, just swirling white. Noah stood unmoving for a minute, his senses sharp as a blade. Then, muttering to himself, he stepped back inside and locked the door. He turned the radio down and sat with his soup lukewarm now and tried to read a book. Hemingway. But the words slipped off the page. Outside, the storm had grown teeth, shaking the cabin walls with deep groans. Then it came again, louder, a scraping just outside. He rose, crossed to the window, and parted the curtain. The flashlight beams sliced into the storm, and there, just beyond the porch, rail movement. He pressed his face closer to the glass. Through the curtain of snow, he made out a large form. No 3 forms. Low to the ground, unsteady, not bears, too lean, too deliberate. He opened the window a crack. The cold punched in like a fist. Then a sound, a a sharp whimper, high-pitched and broken. A dog, maybe more than one. The snow thinned for a moment, and the flashlight caught their shapes fully. A large German shepherd, ribs showing beneath her ice-crusted coat, was limping toward the cabin. Her ears were back, but not from aggression, from pain, fatigue. Trailing her were two small pups, barely big enough to wade through the snow. They struggled behind her, their tiny legs disappearing with each step. The mother dog reached the porch and collapsed onto her side. She curled herself around the pups, her breath rising in heavy, exhausted puffs. One of the puppies whimpered and tried to burrow deeper into her fur. Noah stared, unmoving. The rules were clear. Wildlife, even stray dogs, meant danger, disease, desperation, and yet, something in the way the mother had collapsed, the way she had shielded the pups with her body, not lashing out, but merely enduring. It stirred something in him, something that had not stirred since Margaret's voice faded into the hospital silence. He stood frozen at the door, hand hovering above the handle. He didn't open it, not yet. But something shifted. In the space between firelight and frost, between instinct and mercy, a man who had locked the world out began to listen again. Outside, the storm screamed. Inside, the silence waited. And on the porch, a dying dog and her two trembling pups breathed against the cold, not knowing that fate had brought them to the one man who might still remember how to open a door. The wind hadn't let up. If anything, it had grown teeth overnight, clawing at the eaves of the cabin with restless fingers. Noah Walker sat near the hearth, his coffee long gone cold in his hands, his eyes fixed on the door. He hadn't slept. Not really. Every time he closed his eyes, the image returned. Three dark shapes huddled beneath the storm, motionless, except for the occasional tremble of breath. The fire cracked again, and Noah finally stood. He crossed to the window, where frost had crept like ivy across the glass. With his sleeve, he wiped a small circle clear. Outside, the world was a frozen canvas, silent, buried in white. And there they were, still there, the German shepherd and her two pups. No barking, no growling, just the stillness of survival, slipping. He had lived through many Montana winters, but this storm felt different, like a reckoning. He reached for his flashlight again and unlatched the door. Cold exploded into the cabin, and he stepped out, breath misting instantly. The snow crunched beneath his boots, deceptively soft above a crust of ice. The shepherd raised her head weakly as he approached, but there was no growl, no snap of teeth. Her amber eyes met his, not pleading, not wild, just empty from exhaustion. Her coat, a mix of black and tan, was stiff with frost, and snow had gathered like a second skin over her back. One pup was pressed beneath her chest, the other barely moving by her hind leg. Their bodies were small, underfed. Noah guessed they were no more than 5 or 6 weeks old. "Hey now," he said quietly, crouching a few feet away. "I'm not here to hurt you." The mother dog gave a soft grunt, but didn't move. He slowly removed a wool blanket from under his coat, laid it out in front of her, and backed away. She watched him. Nothing more. Then, after what felt like a full minute, she shifted. A painful movement, but deliberate. She nosed the pup at her leg toward the blanket, then the other, then slowly lay across them. Noah stepped backward. "All right," he muttered. "That's something." Back inside, he cleared out the old wood staging area, a small insulated room that had once been part of his tool shop. He dragged in another space heater, set up a sleeping pad, and surrounded it with thick quilts. A few worn towels, a basin of warm water, and an unopened can of tuna from the pantry. He wasn't sure what dogs liked, but it was protein and warmth. At the front door again, he paused, breathing hard. It was a dangerous thing he was doing. He knew that. Wild dogs, even if once domestic, were unpredictable. But something about the shepherd, her eyes, her silence spoke of another life, another bond long lost. He couldn't turn away. Not again. With steady hands, Noah opened the door wider and approached. "Come on, girl, let's get you warm." She didn't move. He dropped to one knee and gently picked up one of the pups, wrapping it in the blanket. The mother whimpered low, but didn't resist. He carried the pup inside, then returned for the second. When he came back for her, she struggled to stand, legs trembling beneath her. He didn't touch her, only waited. And then, slowly, she followed. Inside the storage room, the heat was faint, but to her it must have felt like firelight in spring. She lay down heavily as Noah placed both pups beside her. She sniffed them, licked their ears, then let out a long breath that sounded like surrender. He sat in the corner, watching. She watched back. Later that morning, the storm finally paused, just briefly. Enough to let in a breath of light through the clouds. Noah took the moment to check his equipment, refill the heater fuel, and step outside for firewood. As he opened the back door, he noticed fresh tracks, small, human tracks leading through the snow toward the edge of the woods. He squinted. A girl, thin frame, wrapped in a red parka 3 sizes too big. Maybe 13 or 14. She was standing by a broken trail sign, facing his cabin, unmoving. Noah raised a hand. "Hey there! You all right?" She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was hesitant. "Are they here?" "What?" "The dogs," she said. "The ones I was feeding. Did they make it to you?" He blinked, then it clicked. She walked closer. Her face was pale, freckled, with wind-chapped cheeks and wide green eyes. "I saw them 2 days ago, near the old ranger station. They were following me. I tried to leave food, but—" She looked down. "I couldn't stay out long. My uncle doesn't let me." Noah softened. "What's your name?" June Dillard." He recognized the last name. The Dillards lived across the valley, about 2 miles away. Her uncle Hank was a retired mechanic known for being rough around the edges. June must be his niece. "Well, June," Noah said, "they're safe. Cold and tired, but safe." Her eyes lit up. "Can I see them?" "Not now. They're resting. But maybe later. You live far?" She nodded. "I should go. I just wanted to know. Thank you for helping them." She turned before he could stop her. The girl disappeared into the curtain of white like a ghost that had walked out of his past. Back inside, the dogs were asleep. The mother now snored gently, her pups nestled against her side, their bellies rising with steadier breaths. Noah sat outside the door, leaning his head back against the wall. He thought of June's eyes, her worry, her kindness despite her age. And he thought of Margaret again, of how she'd always said, kindness finds its way back. He looked through the small window into the warm room. The shadows in the snow were no longer shadows. They had names, they had breath, they had hope. The next morning arrived with no sunlight, only a gray wash of sky that pressed low against the earth like a burden. Snow fell silently, thick and steady, muting the world in a hush that made every movement feel sacred. Inside the small cabin, the air was warmer, but still tense, as if it too awaited Noah's decision. The mother German shepherd had not moved much during the night. She lay curled tightly around her 2 pups, forming a living wall against the cold. Her breaths were slow but steady, eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. The pups had stopped shivering. A small mercy. One of them, a little male with a black muzzle and the faintest patch of white on his chest, had managed to sit up briefly, wobbling before toppling back down. The other pup, smaller and with a tan stripe down her snout, barely stirred at all. Noah watched them from the other side of the glass window that separated the storage room from his kitchen. He sipped a cup of bitter coffee, hands cupped around the ceramic for warmth, though the heat barely touched the frost in his bones. He'd spent most of the night pacing the cabin, checking and rechecking the generator, the propane lines, and the back door lock. He couldn't get the shepherd's eyes out of his head. They haunted him, those amber orbs filled with something more ancient than fear. Something that tasted like resignation, like she had decided not just that this was the end, but that it was supposed to be, and that somehow she'd still brought her pups to his doorstep anyway. His father's voice rang in his head, gruff and unsentimental. "Out here, sentiment gets you killed." But his mother's voice was louder this time, warm and steady. "Even in the wild, kindness keeps you human." He was caught in between. By midday, the storm had picked up again. Wind lashed against the eaves, and snow piled higher against the north-facing window. Noah shoveled it back twice, more out of habit than necessity. Each time he passed the storage room door, the shepherd lifted her head slightly, tracking him, not with suspicion, but with expectation. He sighed and rubbed his temples. Around 2 in the afternoon, the power flickered, then cut completely. He moved fast, within minutes. The generator was up and running, but the jolt was enough to shake him. If he hadn't prepared, if he hadn't maintained the lines every season, he'd be facing a freezing night with no backup. He turned the heater in the storage room higher, then went in. The shepherd stiffened as he opened the door, but didn't growl. Noah crouched a few feet away. "You shouldn't be alive," he murmured, studying her more closely now. She was older than he'd thought, maybe 6 or 7 years. Her ears were tattered at the edges, one with a healed split. Her coat, even where not frozen, was patchy, likely from stress or malnutrition. Her body was gaunt, ribs faintly visible even beneath the fluff of fur. But her legs were strong, and her stare was steady. Noah reached for the metal bowl near the wall and poured warm broth into it, leftover chicken stock, diluted but fragrant. She sniffed the air, then inched forward. When she drank, it was slow and cautious. He poured a little more, then one of the pups cried, a faint yip, high and breathy. The shepherd turned immediately, nosing them gently. The little one with the white chest tried to nurse, but found no milk. The mother licked his ear anyway. Noah's heart clenched. They needed more than warmth. They needed real care. And yet, he hadn't even named them. He hadn't allowed himself that. A knock startled him from thought. He stood sharply and crossed to the main door. When he opened it, wind surged inside like a wave. Snowflakes bit into his skin. Standing there, bundled in a patched red parka and carrying a satchel over one shoulder, was June. She was flushed from the cold, but determined, green eyes locked on his. "I brought something," she said, holding out a jar. "Goat's milk, from our neighbor. They still have a doe producing. It's all I could think of." He hesitated. "You walked here again?" "Uncle Hank's asleep. I snuck out." Noah studied her. 13, maybe 14, tall for her age, with narrow shoulders and hands that trembled slightly. Not from cold, but from nerves. The wind had chapped her lips and dyed her nose red. Still, there was a resolve in her that reminded him of Margaret. "You shouldn't be walking through a storm like this," he said finally, taking the jar. "I had to. They're my fault." "They're not your fault. I fed them once, in the woods. I left food. I thought maybe I'd made it worse, like they started depending on me and—" She trailed off. Noah stepped aside. "Come in before you freeze." Inside, June stripped off her gloves, eyes darting toward the storage room. "Still too early," he said. "They're resting, but they're alive. That's more than I thought yesterday." June nodded, brushing her wet bangs from her eyes. "I want to help." He looked at her again. Really looked. And saw, under the windburn and awkwardness, a flicker of someone who didn't just care about animals, but who had already known loss. She reminded him of Ellie. He didn't ask what happened to June's parents. The fact that she lived with Uncle Hank told enough. "You can help," he said finally. "But not today. Today you warm up, drink something hot, and stay here until it's safe to walk home." They sat in silence for a while. June sipped cocoa, while Noah prepared a bottle with the goat milk. As he wrapped it in a towel to keep it warm, the weight of the moment settled. He would feed the pups. He would keep the heater on. He would leave the door cracked at night. Noah had made his decision, not with grand words or gestures, but by not turning away. In this place, in this storm, that was everything. The wind howled against the cabin walls like a restless spirit trapped between mountains, shaking the eaves and sending flurries of snow spiraling into every crack it could find. But within the small timber cabin on Timberwolf Ridge, a kind of quiet had begun to settle, a stillness not born from absence, but from intent. Noah Walker moved through the storage room like a man preparing a sanctuary. The space had once been used for firewood and old tools, but today it would serve another purpose. He'd spent the morning insulating the drafty gaps along the floor with towels, placing a second heater near the corner, and laying out thick folded quilts he hadn't touched since Margaret's final winter. A small lamp glowed in the far corner, casting a faint yellow warmth that reached the walls like sunlight in a dream. The goat's milk June had brought was now poured into 2 baby bottles, warmed and wrapped in cloth. Noah's back ached from shoveling snow away from the door earlier, but his hands didn't slow. This wasn't a chore, it was a vow. Whether the dogs survived or not, they would not die alone and cold. Outside, the shepherd and her pups lay pressed against the porch wall. Snow had gathered across the mother's back, her head barely lifted. The pups had stopped crying. Noah didn't like that silence. He grabbed a blanket and stepped into the storm. Each step was a battle. Wind whipped his coat, stung his eyes, and pushed against him as if trying to reverse his decision. but he crouched beside the shepherd and whispered gently, "Come on, girl, let's get you inside." She blinked slowly. He touched her side cold, but still rising with breath. He picked up the first pup, the larger one, and wrapped it in the blanket, cradling it like a child. The mother made a strained noise but didn't resist. When he returned for the second, the pup barely stirred. He wrapped it gently and turned to the mother. Her legs buckled when she tried to rise. Noah hesitated. He couldn't lift her. She was too large, and he didn't want to cause injury. But when he stepped back and held the door open, a warm gust of air escaped, and something flickered in her eyes. Hope, or instinct, maybe both. Slowly, painfully, she pulled herself up and limped after him, staggering with each step, snow falling from her shoulders like a discarded cloak. Inside the storage room, Noah lowered both pups onto the quilts near the heater. They were too weak to move much, but one let out a faint whine, and the other shifted its head toward the warmth. The mother followed and collapsed heavily beside them, her body forming a protective curve. Steam rose from her back as the room's heat began to thaw the ice crusted along her spine. Noah stepped back, breathless, heart pounding, not from fear, but awe. She was inside. They were safe. For now. He didn't notice the woman standing in his front doorway until she called his name. "Noah?" He turned sharply, eyes widening. "Amy?" Amy Whitaker was wrapped in a thick canvas coat dusted with snow, a forest green scarf around her neck, and wool-lined boots nearly up to her knees. Her auburn hair, damp with melting flakes, peeked out from beneath a beanie, and a leather satchel hung across her chest. She was in her late 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of steady presence that had calmed hundreds of wild animals in her years as a traveling wildlife responder. Noah hadn't seen her in nearly 5 years. Amy had once worked for the same environmental nonprofit where Margaret volunteered part-time. She'd been at the funeral, brought a pie. They had exchanged letters for a while, talking about grief, about bears and trail cameras and what silence does to a person. Then the distance grew. Life had its currents. "What are you doing here?" he asked. She stepped inside, brushing off her coat. "I was checking trail cams near Clearwater. Lost the road when the snow picked up. My Jeep's about a mile back, stuck good. I remembered your cabin was nearby." "Of all days," he muttered and gestured to the room behind him. "You're not going to believe this." Amy followed his gaze. Her eyes softened immediately. "Shepherd?" "Yeah. Came to the porch with her pups yesterday. I couldn't leave them." She stepped toward the storage door, peering through the glass. "She's older, thin, scar on the left ear. That might be Ginger." "You know her?" "There's been a group of feral shepherds near the border. A farmer said one kept stealing eggs from his hen house, but never touched the hens. Clever, quiet. He said she was leading 2 pups. I've been trying to locate them for weeks." Noah blinked, then chuckled softly. "So, I'm harboring fugitives." Amy smiled. "The best kind." They sat at the kitchen table with mugs of tea. Amy told him about the ice-locked roads, her organization's recent rescue of a lynx trapped in wire, and how her station in Missoula was short 2 volunteers this month. Noah listened, nodded, offered to call June's house to let them know she was safe if she dropped by again. There was no mention of Margaret, no need. It was there, between pauses. Later, when they checked on the shepherd, Amy gently reached her hand toward the dog. Ginger sniffed, then laid her head down on her paws. No fear, just trust. Amy examined the pups. "She's dry, not producing, probably lost most of her milk before the storm. They won't last long without feeding." "I have goat milk. June brought it." Amy smiled. "That girl's a gift." Together, they fed the pups from warmed bottles. The larger ones suckled eagerly, while the smaller needed encouragement, tiny paws twitching against Amy's hand. The door was closed. The storm raged outside. But inside, warmth spread, not just from heaters or tea, but from something long dormant beginning to stir again in Noah's chest. He looked at Amy, at the dogs, at the firelight flickering against the wooden walls. The cabin had been silent for years. But now, for the first time, it felt like someone had opened not just the storage room door, but something deeper. The third morning broke pale and slow, the storm finally withdrawing like a great, tired animal slinking back into the mountains. A brittle stillness clung to the landscape. The snow piled high against cabin walls, glazed with a sheen of ice from the previous night's freezing winds. But inside the small cabin on Timberwolf Ridge, the world was stirring with breath and quiet motion. Noah Walker crouched beside the now transformed storage room, which felt more like a nursery than a shed. The air was warm and dense with the subtle scent of dogs, quilts, and heated pine walls. Ginger, the German shepherd, still lay curled around her pups, but her posture had changed. No longer collapsed with exhaustion, she now held her head high, ears alert and half-cocked toward the door, where Noah sat just outside the threshold. The pups had begun to move. The larger one Noah had started calling him Mo was the first to lift his head. He wobbled, then planted his paws uncertainly and tried to crawl forward, only to fall into the folds of the blanket. The smaller pup, more delicate and slower to respond, blinked against the low lamplight. Noah called her Luna, for the way her tan stripe curled like a crescent moon along the bridge of her nose. Ginger licked them both in slow, maternal motions, pausing once to meet Noah's eyes. This time, there was no fear in that gaze, no suspicion, just a deep, tired knowing. Noah leaned against the wall with a sigh. He had slept no more than 2 hours, spending much of the night warming milk, adjusting the heater, and writing. Yes, writing again, in an old leather-bound journal he had once thought useless after Margaret died. Last night, words had come again. Not many, but enough. Amy Whitaker had slept on the couch, her long legs curled awkwardly beneath a woven quilt. Her boots were set by the fire to dry, her coat folded with military precision on the backrest. She had left early that morning to retrieve her Jeep now that the path was somewhat clearer, promising to return by sundown if the roads allowed. She had left behind 2 medical kits, several small feeding bottles, and something Noah hadn't expected. A note, folded in thirds, written in clean looping cursive. "You're not just keeping them alive, you're learning to breathe again. Amy." Noah hadn't known what to say to that. Mid-morning, a tapping came at the front door. June. She stood bundled in 3 layers of scarves and a down jacket 2 sizes too big, boots caked in snow, a knitted beanie pulled over her ears. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, but her eyes were wide and bright. In her gloved hands, she held a thermos and a folded towel. "Morning," she said breathlessly. "Mom's out volunteering at the church. I told Uncle Hank I was going to check traps near the woods." Noah raised a brow. "That true?" She grinned. "Only about 80%. He stepped aside and let her in. "They're alive," he said. "Mo and Luna." Her face softened instantly. "You name them?" "They name themselves," he replied. June set the thermos down. "It's warm broth. I looked up recipes for pups who can't nurse. Internet's still spotty, but I figured something simple was better than nothing." He nodded and handed her one of the feeding bottles. Together, they knelt beside the threshold to the storage room. Ginger lifted her head, but did not move, watching carefully as June held out the bottle. Luna, slow but curious, leaned forward and latched on after a few moments. Mo, not to be outdone, scrambled awkwardly toward Noah's hand and began suckling eagerly. Noah smiled, and it surprised him. June noticed. "You're different today." "Am I?" "You're not as heavy," she said carefully. "Like the air around you isn't full of sadness anymore." Noah didn't answer right away. Instead, he adjusted the heater slightly, making sure it wasn't drying out the air too much. "Grief's a long storm," he said. "Sometimes it settles into the bones." "Yeah," she whispered, eyes still on Luna. "I know." She didn't elaborate. He didn't push. That afternoon, the sun finally broke through the cloud cover, spilling soft golden light across the snow-laden trees. Noah stepped outside for fresh air and found the mountains glowing with a deceptive peace. The forest was alive with silence, and the occasional groan of ice cracking in branches. For the first time in days, the world looked survivable. He shoveled a narrow path around the cabin, enough for Amy's return and maybe to access the woodpile more easily. As he worked, he caught a flicker of movement in the trees, just the rustle of a bird taking off, or a fox darting between shadows. It reminded him the world hadn't stopped outside the walls of his grief. Back inside, June had fallen asleep beside the storage room door, curled up with her arms folded under her head. Ginger had inched closer to the edge of her blankets, her muzzle resting on her paws just a foot away from the girl. It was a picture Noah didn't want to disturb, so he watched in silence, letting the moment unfold. As evening crept in, Amy returned, brushing snow from her coat and hair. She brought news of power restoration in Clearwater, and that the roads were passable by SUV, but still slick. She'd spoken with the ranger station. They had space to take in the shepherd and her pups when they were stronger. Noah nodded, but didn't reply. Later, when June had left and the dogs were asleep again, he stood with Amy in the narrow kitchen. "You're not ready to let them go, are you?" she asked. "I don't know," he admitted. "They came here like ghosts, but now they feel real." "They are real. So are you." Ginger shifted in her sleep. Mo let out a small bark in his dream. Luna stretched against her mother's flank. The room felt full, not just with sound, but with something Noah hadn't felt in years. Life. The sun lingered longer now. It wasn't spring, not yet, but the light had changed. Softer, warmer. It filtered through the pines and cast golden stripes across the snow-dusted porch of Noah Walker's cabin. Inside, warmth flowed not only from the fireplace, but from the quiet rhythm of life, returning, steady and unsure, but real. Ginger, the mother German shepherd, now rose each morning without trembling. Her coat, once stiff with ice and loss, had begun to regain its gloss. She patrolled the perimeter of the storage room with the solemn dignity of a guardian, her pups Mo and Luna tumbling behind her in a flurry of legs and soft yips. They were no longer just surviving. They were learning to play. Noah had stopped timing the hours. Time no longer pressed against him like a weight. He spent mornings mending the woodpile, cleaning the water lines, and, something he hadn't done in years, reorganizing the radio corner in the main room. The radio had belonged to his late father, a shortwave transceiver with dials worn smooth from years of weather bulletins, ranger chatter, and static. For a long time after Margaret passed, Noah had left it untouched, the dust gathering like a refusal to connect with anything or anyone beyond these walls. But now, with Ginger and her pups curled beside the heater, and Amy visiting every few days, and June appearing like a stubborn sunrise each morning, connection no longer felt like intrusion. It felt necessary. He spent that afternoon cleaning the inside of the old transceiver, replacing brittle wires, realigning the antenna. The static buzzed to life slowly, like the cabin exhaling. A voice flickered in and out. Snow drifted past, still searching. He adjusted the dial, carefully narrowing the frequency until the signal came in clearly. "This is Amy Whitaker, responding to Sector 2. Visibility's improving around Timberwolf Ridge, but still no sign of the missing shepherd and pups. Last sighting was near Miller's Bend. Over." Noah blinked. He didn't hesitate. He leaned toward the mic and pressed the button. "Amy, this is Timberwolf Cabin. Over." A beat of silence. Then, "Noah, is that you?" His lips curved before he realized it. "It's me. You're coming in loud and clear." "I didn't know this radio still worked," she said, voice slightly crackling with interference. "I didn't either, just tuned it up this morning." "Talk about timing," she replied. Then after a pause, "Are you calling about the dogs?" He looked toward the storage room, where Luna had just tripped over a towel, and Mo was attempting to chew on a slipper. Ginger was calmly ignoring both, blinking with regal disinterest. "They're here," he said. "They've been here since the storm." A long silence. "Ginger too?" Amy asked, her voice softer now. "Yes, all three. Alive and well." A breath of static passed before she responded. "I filed them as lost. The ranger team assumed they'd frozen days ago. Noah, this is big." "I know." Amy's voice came through clearer, firmer. "The Wildlife Recovery Network will want to move them to the sanctuary when the weather clears. I can help transport them. Ginger may not be fully feral. She was likely owned once trained even, but the pups need proper nutrition, vet care, and maybe a shot at adoption." Noah didn't answer right away. He watched as Mo tumbled into a blanket, barking in confusion, and Luna pounced on his tail with squeaky delight. Ginger raised her head briefly, then lay it down again. "I understand," he said at last. Amy's voice softened. "It doesn't mean goodbye. It just means better." Later that day, June arrived with a small radio of her own, tucked under her arm, a hand-me-down from her uncle, covered in scratch stickers and missing a volume knob. "You fixed yours?" she asked, noticing the soft hum of static from Noah's table. He nodded. "It still works." "That's cool. Sometimes I listen to weather alerts. Uncle Hank thinks it's boring, but I like how it sounds, like ghosts trying to talk. He raised a brow. Ghosts? Yeah, like they're stuck between now and before. That night, as the pups fell asleep curled against Ginger's stomach, and the cabin settled into the low hum of quiet warmth, Noah sat beside the fire with a mug of tea and an open journal. Amy's words stayed with him. It doesn't mean goodbye. It just means better. He stared into the fire and thought of Margaret, how she'd insisted he keep the radio, how she used to sit at this very hearth knitting sweaters no one ever wore. She had believed in signs, in second chances, and perhaps, just perhaps, these dogs, this winter were hers. A way of telling him that the world still held room for love, for purpose. He leaned forward, clicked on the mic, and said softly into the frequency, Amy, if you're listening, I think we're ready. Outside, the moon rose full and white above the snow-tipped trees, and inside the cabin, nothing stirred but the quiet rise and fall of breathing of life choosing, again and again, to stay. The snow had stopped falling 3 nights ago, and, in its absence, silence stretched out like a blanket across Timberwolf Ridge. The landscape lay pristine and untouched, every tree and stone dusted with white, the sunlight finally bold enough to pierce the haze and bathe the forest in gold. After weeks of relentless storm, the world had finally exhaled. Inside Noah Walker's cabin, the air was different too, lighter, infused with the kind of warmth that had nothing to do with the fireplace. There was laughter now, sometimes quiet, sometimes clumsy, usually coming from June as she chased Mo, the larger of the 2 pups, who had stolen one of her gloves and was refusing to give it back. Luna sat like a little queen beside her mother, Ginger, who had taken to lying near the window where the sun pooled on the wooden floor. Her fur had regained its sheen, and the sharpness in her amber eyes had returned, not feral but alert, aware. She watched everything, including Noah, with a gaze that had shifted from wary to something like grateful. Noah stood at the kitchen counter, stirring a pot of soup he'd started from scratch onions, carrots, leftover roast. The cabin smelled like thyme and roasted bone, and the low hum of life filled the space in a way it hadn't in years. Amy was due to arrive within the hour to escort the dogs to the Wildlife Recovery Network's sanctuary, a facility a few hours south that specialized in resocializing animals who had lived on the edge of survival. It was a good place, a kind place. But Noah's stomach was tight. They don't know yet, do they? June asked, her breath fogging the window as she knelt beside Ginger. No, he replied, but she does. He turned his eyes to the shepherd, who returned his gaze with quiet composure. For the last day and a half, Ginger had been more restless. She'd begun pacing near the door, sniffing the wind, tilting her head at distant sounds in the woods. She wasn't uneasy, she was ready. Noah had seen that kind of resolve before. In Margaret's final days, there had been a shift not of despair, but of peace, of letting go. June reached out and stroked Ginger's ear, her fingers trembling slightly. Will they remember us? They will, Noah said. In their way? At that moment, the soft crunch of tires on snow signaled Amy's arrival. Her SUV came into view beyond the cabin edge, the windshield reflecting the late morning sun. She stepped out wearing her field jacket and heavy boots, her red scarf wrapped tight against the cold. Her auburn hair was tied back this time, and a clipboard was tucked under one arm. She moved with confidence, her stride long and sure. Amy Whitaker had always been a woman of action, tall, strong-shouldered, with a weather-beaten face that carried the softness of compassion and the steel of experience. She had worked with everything from injured coyotes to orphaned mountain lions, but something about this case, about Ginger, had settled differently in her chest. She knocked gently and stepped inside. It smells incredible in here, she said, loosening her scarf. You making goodbye soup? More like holding it together soup, Noah replied, handing her a steaming mug. She accepted it, her fingers brushing his. The van's ready. They've got space at the sanctuary, and Dr. Fenley, our vet, is already prepping the observation area. She'll want to monitor Ginger and the pups for a few days, but from what you've told me, their prognosis is excellent. June stood now, stiff and quiet. Do they have to leave today? Amy looked at her gently. It's the right time, the weather's holding, and Ginger's strong again. She needs a place to teach those pups without having to worry about food or safety. She's done her part. Now, We help with the rest." The words were logical, kind even, but they did nothing to soften the ache in the room. Noah walked over to the storage room and opened the door. Ginger rose immediately, alert but calm. She stepped out slowly, Mo and Luna trotting beside her. They paused only once when Ginger turned back to look at him. Her eyes held something ancient, not sadness, not even farewell, just knowing. He knelt and whispered, "You're free now." She stepped forward. The pups hesitated until Amy knelt down with 2 treats in her palm. Mo rushed first, Luna more tentative. June followed, carrying their blanket folded neatly under her arm. The door was left open and the dogs stepped out into the light. The snow crunched softly under Ginger's paws as she led her pups down the cleared path. Amy guided them toward the SUV, where soft bedding had been laid out in the back. Mo leapt up without hesitation. Luna needed a gentle lift. Ginger followed last, stopping briefly to glance at the forest line beyond. Then she stepped inside and settled between her children, her body forming a protective curve around them once more. Amy closed the hatch and turned to Noah and June. "They'll be okay," she said. Noah nodded. "I know." Amy hesitated. "And you? Will you?" He glanced toward the trees, then back at the cabin. "Maybe not right away, but yes." June wiped her eyes with the back of her glove. "I'll miss them." "They'll miss you too," Noah said. "But you gave them their second chance. That matters." The SUV reversed slowly, snow spiraling behind its wheels. Ginger's shape was still visible in the rear window, her head turned, ears up. Then, just before the vehicle vanished down the bend, Ginger stood tall and pressed her nose briefly to the glass. Her amber eyes locked on the cabin one last time. And then they were gone. Noah and June stood in silence for a long moment. Then, together, they turned and walked back inside. The cabin, once again quiet, no longer felt empty. The bowls were still by the wall. The blanket still held the shape of where the pups had slept. The radio still buzzed faintly in the corner. "You want to keep helping animals?" Noah asked suddenly. June looked up, surprised. "Me? You've got the heart for it. And Amy could use volunteers." A slow smile spread across her face. "Yeah, I'd like that." That afternoon, as the sun slipped past the tree line and shadows stretched long across the snow, Noah stood on the porch, mug in hand. The wind had calmed, the sky was clear, and somewhere beyond the trees, a shepherd and her pups were beginning their new life, and so was he. The snow had long since melted from Timberwolf Ridge, leaving behind a carpet of pine needles, damp earth, and the first stubborn sprouts of green. Patches of wild crocus bloomed along the lower trails, their lavender petals brave and unbothered by the cold nights that still lingered. The wind no longer howled but whispered, soft and warm, weaving between tree branches like an old friend. Noah Walker stood outside his cabin, hands deep in the pockets of his flannel shirt. The air smelled of sap and thawing soil. Overhead, a hawk circled lazily in a sky that had forgotten the color gray. Behind him, the front door stood open, letting sunlight spill into a space that no longer feared light. Inside, the radio played quietly folk music from a local station in Missoula. A half-finished birdhouse sat on the workbench, and June's blue backpack leaned against the wall. She had taken to spending Saturdays helping Noah around the cabin. In the weeks since the dogs had left, she had asked questions about woodworking, compass reading, and how to recognize animal tracks in fresh mud. She no longer came just to visit the memory of Mo and Luna. She came for herself, and maybe, in part, for the version of Noah who had learned to welcome her. Amy had kept her promise. She visited often, sometimes with news, sometimes with laughter. She had brought with her pieces of the world outside Noah's grief, invitations to community potlucks, updates on new rescues, and once a bag of old letters Margaret had helped write for the local wildlife center's education program years ago. It was Amy who helped Noah realize something simple but profound. He didn't need to leave the cabin to be part of the world again. He just needed to let the world come in. On this particular Saturday, Amy had invited him to join her on a survey trip to a nearby meadow that had been reopened after a rock slide had closed it off the previous year. The plan was simple: hike in, check for nesting sites, maybe catalog tracks if the ground was dry enough. Noah had hesitated at first, reluctant to leave the comfort of his cabin, but in the end, he'd agreed. They met at the trailhead just before noon. Amy was already there, her tall frame silhouetted against the trees, a canvas rucksack slung over one shoulder, binoculars around her neck. She wore a long-sleeved field shirt, khaki pants tucked into scuffed boots, and a navy cap pulled low over her face. Her freckles had returned with the sun, and her auburn hair curled at the ends from spring humidity. "You ready?" she asked with a grin. "More than I thought I'd be," Noah admitted, adjusting the straps of his borrowed day pack. The trail wound gently uphill, lined with spruce and red fir. Patches of melting snow crunched beneath their boots, and the forest was alive with birdsong. They spoke little at first, content in the rhythm of the hike. Occasionally, Amy would pause to inspect a tuft of fur caught on bark, or point out a new growth of wild mushrooms. As they crested a ridge and entered a clearing framed by tall larches, Noah felt something shift, an old, familiar awareness prickling at the back of his neck. A presence, not threatening, but electric. Then he saw them. At the far end of the meadow, half camouflaged by the trees, stood a German shepherd. Larger than she had been in winter, but unmistakable. Ginger. Her coat gleamed in the sunlight, a patch of silver now threading her left flank, but her stance was proud and unafraid. Beside her were two younger dogs, both nearly full-grown now, one with a black muzzle and broad chest, the other with a tan stripe and elegant build, Mo and Luna. Noah stopped in his tracks. "Amy?" "I see them," she whispered, already lifting her hand slowly. "Let's move slow." But Mo had already broken into a run. The young shepherd bounded across the clearing, legs flailing with joyful urgency, tail a blur. Noah dropped to one knee just as the dog launched himself forward, almost knocking him off balance. Mo buried his snout into Noah's chest, whining and licking at his hands, his eyes wide with recognition and delight. Noah laughed, an unguarded, bright sound he hadn't heard from himself in years. Luna trotted up moments later, more composed, but her ears perked and her eyes warm. She nudged his elbow and then leaned into his shoulder. Ginger approached last, slow and graceful, her head held high. She stopped a few feet away, watching. Noah extended his hand. Ginger stepped forward and pressed her muzzle into his palm. "Hey there," he said softly. "You remember." Amy stayed a respectful distance behind, her hand resting lightly on a nearby tree. She smiled, but said nothing. The reunion didn't need words. After some time, Ginger turned her head toward the woods. Mo and Luna followed, though not before Mo gave one final, affectionate headbutt against Noah's leg. Ginger looked back one last time, her amber eyes meeting Noah's, with a gaze both steady and serene. Then she turned and disappeared into the trees, her children at her side. Noah stood slowly, brushing pine needles from his jeans. "You okay?" Amy asked. He nodded. "I will be." They started walking again, this time not toward anything in particular, just forward. The forest embraced them, and the day rolled on with birdsong and wind and the soft crush of boots against damp soil. When they returned to the cabin that evening, the light was honeyed and long. June had left a note pinned to the door. "Built a birdhouse from your scraps. Hope that's okay. I think I'm getting the hang of this." Noah smiled. Inside, the fire was already laid. The bowls were still where they had been, but now they no longer waited in grief. They remained as quiet reminders of love given and received. He sat by the window, looking out over the trees. Somewhere beyond, Ginger was watching too. Sometimes the most powerful rescue isn't the one we offer, but the one we receive when we open our hearts again. This story isn't just about a mother dog and her pups. It's about second chances, quiet bravery, and the healing that happens when we let love back in. In our everyday lives, we all pass by someone, human or animal, who may be carrying more than we can see. Maybe all they need is a moment of warmth, a bit of kindness, a door that opens. If this story moved you even a little, please like the video, share it with someone who needs it today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another tale that warms the soul. And before you go, tell us in the comments, have you ever experienced a moment when someone's small kindness changed everything for you? We'd love to hear your story.